Growing up in a small, rural Vermont town meant that my household didn't have a lot of money, but we still shared everything we had with our extended family. That included letting my aunt, uncle, and cousin move in with us when they got evicted from their house. Everything was just fine until the crying started. For 2 years, from age 12 to age 14, I had to share a room with my little cousin Katie. It wasn't all bad since she was close enough to my age that she wasn't a pest, but I hated the blackout curtains we had to hang so that any outside light didn't keep her up at night. I loved seeing the moonlight filter through the screen in the summer, and I missed that once Katie moved in. It was the second year that they had been living with us when the crying began. At first, I thought it was Katie sobbing quietly when she thought I was asleep, which made sense to me because she had just gotten dumped a few days before. I figured she didn't want to talk because she was ashamed of being the one who got dumped, or she was still just too heartbroken. Over the next few weeks, however, I began realizing that it was coming from different places within our room at night. I couldn't understand why Katie was continuing to cry so much, and anytime I asked her about it, she just looked scared and shook her head. I thought something else had happened between her and her ex-boyfriend, but she just wouldn't talk to me. I told my mom and Ann about it one night when Katie was out at her friend Bree's house, but they just shrugged it off and said that we were going through a rough time. My slightly drunk aunt joked that Katie was probably crying at night because my fashion sense was so bad, and that maybe we should try a nightlight if we were going to be babies. I ignored her and decided that I was done with the whole thing. Things came to a head about a month after I talked to my mom and aunt. I was trying to sleep one night, my CD player earbuds lodged firmly in my ears, when I felt a gentle tug on my pajama top sleeve. I removed the earbuds and turned my face to speak to Katie, even though I couldn't actually see her in the darkness. "What's up?" Instead of an answer, all I got was a sniffle, and before I knew what was happening, Katie had crawled into my bed and curled up next to me. This was so out of character for her that I didn't even question it. I just gently stroked her hair. She quieted down after a bit, and I covered her with my spare blanket because she was so cold. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to Katie moving around next to me. She leaned over, her soft whisper barely reaching my ears. "Run, the one who got me is coming for you." I had no idea what she meant. I felt her get off the bed, and then everything was still and silent again. I strained my eyes to make her out in the pitch darkness, but with the blackout curtains, I couldn't tell where she had gone. "Katie, who's coming? You're creeping me out." She never responded. A primordial growl sliced through the quiet, and a white-hot pain blurred my senses. I screamed as wet, warm liquid ran down my face, and a single hand snaked its way around my throat. I tried to kick out at Katie, but my feet didn't seem to be able to connect with anything. The air was rapidly getting squeezed from my lungs, and no matter how hard I tried, it was impossible for me to tear free of the vice-like hand. I was about to pass out when my door was flung open and my father stood there. The hand had released my throat, and after a moment of catching my breath, I realized it was just my father and I in the room. He shouted to my mom to call an ambulance, and he tried asking me what happened. I frantically begged him to search the room, but there was no one else there. There wasn't even a closet to hide in, and the window was locked from the inside. I ended up passing out from losing so much blood, and I also lost my left eye that night. The doctors tried to blame it on a mixture of sleep paralysis, nightmares, and accidental self-harm, but at 120 pounds and no muscle, even my parents didn't believe that explanation. We moved out of that house immediately, since none of us felt comfortable there anymore. On the night I lost my eye, Katie came to see me in the intensive care unit as soon as her mom picked her up from her new boyfriend's house. I was almost asleep in bed, and I remember her leaning over and whispering to me, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, cuz I wish I could have been there to help you." Even in my drug-induced, mostly asleep state, it struck me that her whisper didn't sound at all like the one that tried to warn me about the attack. I never had another strange experience again, and when we moved, I even got my own room. Since then, I never fail to make sure that some sort of light is on in the room, and on those rare nights when I hear crying, I always make sure to leave the house for a while. As a child, I used to be fascinated with the shining golden dome that graced the top of the Montpelier Capitol building in Vermont. The wooden statue of the Roman goddess Ceres seems to stand so proudly as she surveys the agriculture-loving state, and some people swear that she smiles every time a farmer walks through the building's doors. I'm a 12th-generation Vermonter, and when I was a small child, my grandma shared a lot of the state's old lore with me before she passed away. One of the stories she told used to scare me so badly that I didn't learn how it ended until I was nearly 12, and to this day, it chills me. Before I share it with you, I want to make something clear. You might have heard about a cryptid known as the Pigman of Northfield, but this is not that story. Northfield is a small town in Vermont that likes to boast about having a pigman named Sam Harris since 1951, but the true story is much older than that. It goes like this. In 1741, nearly 50 years before Vermont would become an official state, there was a terrible blizzard. Many people starved, including babies and animals. Most New Englanders would pray to Jesus for salvation and deliverance, but that wasn't who heeded their praise in that forsaken series of storms. The Roman goddess Ceres, known to many by her Greek counterpart name of Demeter, heard the prayers. The prayers came from a group of people who lived in the tiny town of Westminster, and some of them even shared her archaic bloodline. She took pity on the families and promised that, as long as they made sure to celebrate her once a year with an autumn pig roast, she would give them food they so desperately needed. The Vermonters eagerly agreed, blinded by their promise of deliverance. They upheld their end of the bargain for nearly 2 centuries, but forgot to ask what would happen if they ever failed to. In the fall of 1927, a massive flood destroyed parts of Vermont, and in the aftermath of the disaster, the families realized that fall had bled into winter without them having their pig roast. Ceres had been their savior, and in 1858, they had erected the first version of her statue on the Capitol building, but even that was not enough to negate her wrath when her children broke their promise. In a blind rage, the primordial goddess cursed her followers, causing them to turn into pigs. They fed on each other, staining the ground around them as red as maple leaves. Few survived, and those that did were eaten by bears or turned into bacon when nearby farmers found the pigs wandering on their properties. Ceres, a mother herself, chose to spare only one from certain doom. A little girl named Alice White became the first so-called pigman of Vermont, and the goddess had cursed her with humanist sentience. She could walk like a human, think like a human, and feel like a human, but she couldn't talk like one. The rumors say that she ran away from her old home so that her fearful neighbors wouldn't slaughter her or give her to the government to experiment on. Some think that she died on that fateful day along with the rest of her oath-breaking family, and others say that she lived to become the mother of Sam Harris. Whether you believe she's a ghost or something more tangible, the one thing that everyone can agree on is that if you see her and are alone or unable to run, it will be your blood staining her muzzle next. She only leaves behind the gnawed, bloody bones of her victims, nothing more. I myself have never seen a pigman, but there are more than enough eyewitness accounts for me to believe that these creatures are out there. Even if my grandma's story isn't real and a little girl named Alice White never existed, I can't prove that it isn't true. Ceres is known to hate pigs, so who can say that such a powerful deity never cursed a few mortals? I know that I wouldn't bet against her. Growing up in Vermont meant bonfires, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, the most beautiful autumn leaves, and the best maple syrup. It also meant the weirdness that is the region known as the Bennington Triangle, which I didn't learn about until the summer I turned 20. To this day, I wish I never found out about that cursed place. My best friend since childhood was Diane, and she had always been an avid ghost hunter. She loved dragging me along to anywhere that was supposedly haunted, even if we weren't allowed to be there. The Green Mountain Cemetery, Sabin's Pasture, and the Community College of Vermont were just a few of our many stops. I never believed in the supernatural, and for most of my life, I just thought that her midnight graveyard visits and trips to supposedly haunted buildings were a waste of time. My mind was forced to change in the course of a single night in 1983. Our junior year of college had started, and Diane proposed a weekend camping trip to one of the forests in the southern part of the state. She even promised that there wouldn't be any ghost hunting on this trip, which was a nice change of pace. I just wanted to relax for a few days, out in nature, before the harsh Vermont winter drove us to stay inside. A week after she set up the trip, we found ourselves in the middle of the woods outside the tiny town of Somerset, Vermont, on the morning of October 12th, and soon we had set up a nice campsite. We planned to do some hiking and swimming while we were there, so the rest of the first day was spent in lazy bliss as we canoed, chatted, and fished. That night, we cooked up the trout we had caught, and it was a peaceful night spent under the stars. I slept great and woke up feeling excited for our hike the next day. We got an early start on our trek up Glastonbury Mountain, and by the late afternoon, we had reached the summit. We rested at the top for a while and roasted some burgers over a small fire for dinner. We made sure to thoroughly extinguish the fire, and as the sun began to bleed out, we made our way back down the mountain on the side that would bring us closer to our camp. I wasn't looking forward to hiking in the dark, but I knew I would be fine as long as I wasn't alone. Diane and I had also made sure to wear bright colors, myself in neon yellow and her in flame red, to make it easier to see each other. We had been extra smart and had expected to be heading back to camp in the dark, so we had headlamps ready to go when the last of the light faded. We had made it about a third of the way down when we heard crying. I stopped mid-trail, scanning the area to see what it was. It was clearly the crying of a small child, not the woman-like cries of a mountain lion or another animal. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference, and something about the cry unnerved me. Not a single person lived on the mountain itself, and we hadn't seen anyone at all in the time we had been there for. I strained my eyes, but I couldn't see any other flashlights or lanterns through the dense thicket. I thought I caught a glimpse of something red moving further out among the trees, but it was gone as soon as I blinked. I turned back to ask Diane what she thought was going on, but she was heading off the trail and into the trees. I yelled at her to come back, but she refused, saying that she couldn't just leave a kid alone in the woods. I tried to point out that a family was probably camping nearby, but she ignored me and kept walking towards the sound. Against my better judgment, I followed, hesitating before I stepped off the trail. I didn't want her running through the inky wilderness and getting lost or hurt, but neither did I feel comfortable going off the trail in a place that neither of us knew. Within 10 minutes, I regretted my decision. I had been able to see her for the first few minutes, but then I lost sight of her shirt. Even the sound of her rapid footsteps crunching the dead autumn leaves began to fade, and no amount of shouting had brought her back. I listened, trying to pinpoint any sound, when I saw a flash of red out of the corner of my eye. I was so relieved that Diane had returned that I whipped around, a grin on my face. My relief was immediately replaced by confusion. No one was there, and after a few seconds, it dawned on me that I still hadn't heard a sound. A moment later, a tug on my sleeve made me scream. I looked down in horror, my heartbeat drumming in my ears, and I saw a little boy in a red jacket. He was looking up at me with huge, tear-filled eyes, and I felt my fear soften slightly. "Hey kid, where are your parents at?" I don't know. Mommy was here, but now she's not." I crouched down to eye level, making sure that my headlamp wasn't blinding him. "What's your name?" Paul. "I'm Jeanette, and it's nice to meet you, Paul." He stuck out his hand like a little adult, and I shook it with an amused smile. He was a cute kid, and for the first time, I was glad that we had gone off the trail to find him. "Let's go look for your mom and my friend, okay?" He nodded trustingly, and he slipped his hand into mine. We had no idea which direction to take, so we made our way further into the dense woodland. I kept us going in a straight line from the path, and we made sure to call for Diane and his mom every few minutes. I was getting more and more nervous about going deeper into the forest, but I still couldn't bring myself to abandon my friend. Nearly 2 hours later, we ran into the trail again, and it was very close to our campsite. I was hoping that Diane had been smart enough to wait there for me if she had made it that far, and I was extremely worried at this point. We both had a small flare gun on us in case of an emergency, and that was the only thing assuring me that she was still okay. I got a small fire going since Paul's hand was frigid, and I offered to warm him up some cocoa. He politely declined and curled up in a camping chair by the fire. I sat there in our other chair for about an hour waiting for Diane to return, and at some point I must have dozed off. When I woke, there was a woman by the fire with a weirdly blank look on her face. I blinked rapidly to shake the sleepiness from my eyes, thinking that she was a dream, but the figure remained. I was confused and began to panic when it dawned on me who she was. "Hi, you must be Paul's mom. I'm so glad you found us." "My name is Paula." "Oh, that's cute. You named him after you." "He is not my child." "Oh, sorry." She hadn't moved, and the silence stretched tensely between us. I yawned and rubbed my eyes since I thought I was seeing things. A darkness had begun to seep from her body, and at first I thought it was the firelight casting odd shadows or my eyes playing tricks, but it began to pool from her skeletal fingers on the ground. I swore, quickly scrambling out of the chair and away from her. By then I had noticed that Paul wasn't in sight, and I screamed for him. The woman still hadn't moved, but the ooze had reached my tent. It began to dissolve the nylon, an acidic hiss whirring with the crackling from the fire. I don't remember anything after that except for running towards the car and trying to explain to the police what had happened. They didn't believe me, of course. When we arrived back at the campsite, they blamed drinking and an unguarded fire for the state of the tent, even though there was no alcohol in my system. They began searching for Diane, but never found any trace of another person. 5 years later, her case went cold, and I wouldn't be writing this down if my 12-year-old nephew hadn't asked me to help him on a school project he was working on about people who have seen ghosts. When I asked my nephew why he picked me to interview, he looked up at me, just like little Paul had done, and handed me an old yellowed newspaper article dated October 14th, 1950. It showed a picture of a little boy in a familiar red jacket, and the headline was about his disappearance near Glastonbury Mountain on October 12, 1950. My nephew tugged gently at my sleeve, his eyes wide as he stared at the tears flowing down my cheeks. "Don't cry, Auntie. Not everyone gets to meet 2 ghosts in one night." "2? Yeah. Don't you ever go to the library?" I shook my head, and, exasperated, he pulled out a second article from his school folder. This one had a picture of the woman I had seen that night, and it was about her disappearance from the same area in 1946. They had both been wearing red when they disappeared, and so had Diane. I know I'll never go back there, but if I were, I believe that I would see 3 ghosts. My first experience of sleep paralysis. First, some background. I am a Marine Corps veteran, and I got out because of medical reasons. I was also diagnosed with PTSD. I have never been in combat, but I experienced an event in combat training that happened to me while I was sleeping. This event was considered hazing, and it was done by my own unit. Since this event, I have always had trouble sleeping and staying asleep. I've also had chronic nightmares. Okay, so now for what happened. This happened back in 2015, 2 years after I had gotten out of the military. For a whole month I had been missing work because my medication for my PTSD had stopped working. This caused me agonizing anxiety throughout my days, and I'd have nightmares and flashbacks of what happened to me in combat training at night. Another thing to note, we always kept the hallway light on, and my door is always open so my cats can roam around the house. One night I kept having nightmares of different people breaking into my house. From what I remember, I had 3 different nightmares of 3 separate individuals breaking into my home. After the 3rd nightmare, I woke up to this dark figure standing in my doorway. I tried to scream, "Hey, who the fuck are you?" But nothing came out. It was like I was just screaming inside of my own head. This is when I decided to get up and murder the stranger, but that's when I realized that I couldn't move. My anger quickly became utter fear when I realized that I was completely defenseless and tears started to stream down my face. The figure just stood in the doorway, not moving, not saying anything. When I blinked, the figure disappeared and I was able to move again. I sat up in bed and cried. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I got my medication changed as soon as possible after that night. I have since gotten my PTSD under control again and I am back at work. Even though I still struggle with sleep, I haven't had an episode of sleep paralysis since then. I work as a nanny, and ever since I started working for a new family, I've been getting nightmares of visits. It doesn't help that their house is haunted, so the family and young children have told me. Anyway, I will share the most recent sleep paralysis, or whatever it is, that I had last month. I get one every month. It's been happening for a year now, and this one to me was the worst. Before falling asleep, my mother was coming down for a visit. As it was about 9 p.m., sleep overpowered me and I couldn't wait up anymore with my father. Every Friday, I lock my room door as my dad likes to wake me up to go grocery shopping early Saturday morning, and I want to sleep in. I fell asleep with my music earphones still in my ears. When I awoke from whatever it is this really was, I had only been asleep for about 2 hours, and this is what I dreamt. My earphones started to bother me in my sleep as I turned from side to side, so I removed the plug in my right ear first and then my left ear. As soon as I took the left plug out, it was back in my ear again. Again and again as I removed that same plug, it was back in. That went on for quite some time. When it finally stayed out, I heard scratches at my door. Now I have a cat who sometimes wants to come into my room to sleep with me, but he usually tugs at the bottom of the door with his paw. Never has he ever scratched to come in. It sounded more like a dog wanting in. Screaming, "No! Stop it, Lucas! I said no!" repeatedly didn't work. Screaming only his name in a certain pitch always does it, but even when I screamed his name in that tone, the scratches didn't stop. Pissed off, I got up, opened the door, and said no. But as I looked down and around, my cat was nowhere in sight. Confused, I decided to use the washroom, but I only washed my face. Thinking, hell with my room, I'll sleep with my mom, I made my way to the guest room. I crawl in bed and my mom says, "Hi, Laura." Then I felt something jump on the bed, which was my cat. I asked my mother if he had been there the whole time, and she replied that he had slept with her the whole night so far. I thought I snapped awake from my dream as I found myself back in my bed, in my room. I could see the sunlight shining in my room. I turned my face to the wall, my bed is in a corner, and heard the sound of someone approaching my bedside. Thinking it was my dad wanting to go shopping, I closed my eyes and pretended to be deep asleep. It seemed like he sat near my pillow but didn't do anything, didn't try to wake me up. Confused, I rolled over to take a look. This is the part I really woke up, and it was dark in my room. No sunlight, nothing but darkness. Laying on my back, I felt something on top of me. I couldn't move, and my eyes wouldn't open. Shit scared, I started to pray, although it wouldn't come out. My teeth were chattering. It was impossible to say anything. Eventually, I was able to fully speak, and I kept repeating the Our Father and Hail Mary. After repeating both 3 times, I was able to move. I took that chance to grab my phone and rosary, still praying, and searched the Archangel Michael prayer. After that, the atmosphere in the room changed, and I was good. I created an account to only share this story. I want to get it out there to see if there are others who have had similar experiences. Without drawing this out too long, I will begin by letting you know that sleep paralysis is not and never has been a reoccurring issue for me. There are 2 instances in which this phenomenon happened, once in grade school and recently as an adult reaching my 30s. I can't remember my exact age, but I think it's safe to say I was between 10 and 12 years old the first time. It was the day before Valentine's Day, and I was very sick with a fever, upset I would be missing out on my school's festivities and sweets the following day. I was sent to bed early and terribly ill as I dozed off. Now, this flu could have attributed to my experience. I have thought about the possibility of it being some sort of fever-induced delirium, but some details following made me not entirely positive that this was the case. I must have awoken between 12 and 3 a.m., and I was laying on my side facing the wall my bed was pressed up against. I awoke with a pressing feeling of a presence in my room and assumed it was my mother checking in on me, as my fever was pretty bad. I called out to her and was met with silence. At this point, I knew who or whatever was in my room was not my mother. Fear overtook my rationality. It wasn't that I couldn't move. I was scared to. I did manage to roll onto my back and kept my eyes locked on my ceiling. I did not want to look at it. It was at this time I began to feel a sense of peace, and my dread dissipated. I began to feel comfort from the presence. As soon as my senses calmed, I will never forget what I saw next. A hand came into view, slowly cupping over my brow. It was not human. It was long. The digits on the hand were unusually long as well. The hand was slender, graceful, and downright creepy. It had a luminescence to it like I had never seen. As soon as it made contact with my forehead, I was out cold. The next morning, I awoke in my bed. I shit you not, completely healthy. No fever, no trace of my previously dripping nose and nasty cough. I felt a strange sensation of well-being even. I went immediately to my mother's room and asked if she had been in my room, and confused, she informed me that she had not and commented on my strange behavior. I told her what I could recount from the previous night's experience, and afterwards it was brought up from time to time for years and years after as a very strange occurrence. My mother even went as far as to call it an angel. Now onto the present. I feel it's relevant to mention that I have seen multiple UFOs throughout my life. It may also be worth it to say I live in a very rural state. I have seen UFOs alone, in groups, and with people who can verify their trajectory, so I know I am not insane. Aliens and UFOs do not cross my mind often, as my life is now busy. About a month ago, I had another experience, and it shook me up badly and made me recall the encounter I had as a child. I awoke again around 12 or 3 o'clock a.m. to a distinct feeling of a presence in my room. I thought immediately we had a break-in and the intruder was in the room. I was on my back and filled with so much terror I could not move. I have a nightlight adjacent to my bed that I share with my fiancé. He was sleeping on the side closest to where I assumed this thing was. I was petrified and too scared to look at his side of the bed, and instead saw the shadow of this thing cast on the wall right beside me. It had to have been no taller than 4 feet. From what I could tell from the shadow, it was slender, with a large oval-shaped head. Again, I could not bring myself to look at it. It has bothered me that in these 2 experiences, I could not bring myself to look. Something inside of me said, "It's all over if you see it." Instead of feeling calm, this time I felt like my life was in danger. I did not get the good feelings like I had with my previous encounter. I was out of my mind with fear, and I found I was unable to scream or move anything except my fingers. It raised its hand up, and I instantly recognized it, even by the shadow. It was the same sort of hand I had in my room over 10 years ago. At this point, I could feel my fingers pinching my fiancé's thigh, but he was not waking up. This fueled my panic. I was so scared, I actually passed out. I can't recall any dreams or details from there. The next night, I did lay in bed with the nightlight on, lights off, and asked my fiancé to stand on his knees by the bed. His shadow mimicked an accurate projection placement of whatever was blocking the light the night previously. I have been deeply troubled by this since, and have had no other occasions of sleep paralysis in my entire life. So, was this just some freak brain chemistry hiccup, a lucid nightmare, or actually an encounter with an interdimensional, extraterrestrial being? This only happened yesterday, when me and my best friend were just hanging out as we normally do at my house. We were really bored, so we decided to take a calm walk around my neighborhood, or so we thought. So let me tell you about my block. There is a hospital nearby, and my neighborhood has a history of drug and alcohol-related incidents, but those don't happen very often. Nevertheless, it was kind of dodgy. So me and my friend, for privacy reasons, we'll call her N. We're talking, messing around and such for the entire walk, having a blast in each other's company, until we were about to reach my house to finish the walk. Now, let me set the scene. So we had just turned a corner to walk down our street, with houses on one side, a parkland on the other side, and a 2-lane road separating them. My house is right next to the parkland. Anne and I were walking down the footpath on the side of the parkland towards my house, in silence, just taking in the views, I guess. I don't know. But when we were about 50 meters away from my house, I heard a footstep around 15 meters away from me and Anne. Only one. I casually turned around, expecting a young teenager or an older person because that's usually who we see walking along these footpaths in my area. But what I saw will be burned in the back of my head for years. 15 meters away from us, there was this off-looking man. He looked young, I'd say mid-20s. He had a skinny figure and dull but fierce-looking eyes. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, and he was looking at me with this unsettling look in his eyes. The absolute worst part of this was that the man was limping very aggressively, walking very quickly towards me and N. It looked unnatural. It looked like he was possessed. He was grinning at me with the creepiest smile I have ever seen in my life. It was twisted. His head was cocked to the side, and the man's teeth were so yellow I could see them from 15 meters away. He looked psychotic, and he looked like he wanted to harm us in the most brutal way imaginable. I whipped back around and told Anne to start to quickly walk back to my house, because running might make the man angry and run after us. We didn't know if he was high or drunk or not. I was too panicky, and I didn't even mention why we should haul ass back to my home. Anne turned around and almost screamed and stared in shock. I've never in my life seen someone pull that kind of face before. I grabbed her wrist and we both sped up to reach home. I turned around and the man was 9 or 10 meters away from us, and he was moving quicker with that disturbing broken limp of his. If it didn't look unnatural or scary to even begin with, it sure did now. We were 2 young teenage girls, and even if we both fought against the man, I don't think we would have won, even if he was on the skinnier side. We sped up, and it was a chase. No running, but close enough. He was chasing us with this fast demonic limp, and we tried to speed up to keep the 10-meter gap between us. We managed to get home safely, and I peeked through the window by myself as Anne was in shock for a bit. The man had slowed down, but he was still limping. He then crossed over to the other side of the road. For what reason, I will never know. He went out of sight, and I closed the curtains, still shaky. After all that shit, Anne and I went back into the kitchen to grab some water. My kitchen window kind of overlooks a bit of the parkland, and we have a decent view of it. We both saw the man slink back into the parkland and never saw him after that. Afterwards, I thought about the whole incident and probably got even more unsettled. I only heard one footstep. No pattern, nothing. Just a thump on the ground by a sneaker. That's it. Then it hit me. The man was trying to attack Anne and I. He was trying to sneak up on us. It gives me anxiety knowing that if I didn't hear that single footstep or didn't turn around, we could have been in some serious shit. That man could have had a knife or a different type of weapon in his hoodie pocket. Who knows what could have happened? I've been working as a second shift shelf stocker at my local Walmart for the past month or so, which means I occasionally get to deal with the creepy customers near the end of my shift. Normally, I can sense when someone or something isn't right, which isn't the case for this story, unfortunately. Anyways, I was told to stock the shelves in the area by the pharmacy desk. This was fine by me because not many people come by that side of the store, especially once the pharmacy desk closes for the day. As I'm stocking the aisle that had the cold medicine in it, a girl comes up to me and says, "Hey, you seem like a fun person to talk to." In my mind, I'm like, okay, weird, but whatever. And on the outside, I put on my best retail smile and say, "Sure, what can I help you with?" This girl proceeds to say that she had a bet going on with her dad right now. If she wins the bet, she'll get $100, and she was wondering if I could help her out. Me, being the good-hearted person I am, say that I could help her out. Couldn't be that hard, right? The girl then proceeds to get her guardian, which is a middle-aged woman who then introduces herself. The lady then explains that to help the girl get the $100, I'd have to watch a 20-minute video with them. Obviously, I couldn't do this now as I was working, so they asked me what time I get off work and what I was going to be doing afterwards. I let them know that I got off at 11 and that I was going to drive home with my mom because we both work the same shift at the same store and she doesn't drive. The lady then says, "Okay, well, maybe we can meet at the Southside McDonald's around 11:15 tonight to watch the video. Do you mind if I get your phone number so we can call you?" At this point in time, I was completely oblivious to what was actually happening and gave them my phone number like a complete idiot. The lady then thanks me and says they'd call me around 11:15 and we could go from there. After they walked away, I realized what just happened and what I did and started freaking out. I then went on my last break and told my mom what happened, all while sobbing and freaking out. We decided to go tell management about the incident, and they decided that when my mom and I were both done with work that night, we would be escorted to our car just for extra safety. After this, we told our supervisor what happened and described the individuals to him. He said he was sure he dealt with these same people before at his previous job, and supposedly the same night I was approached by these people, another one of my coworkers encountered them as well, with the same spiel and everything. As my mom and I were being escorted out, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and they didn't leave a voicemail. I started to freak out again, and we decided to go to the cops just to play it safe. After we had told the officer the story and gave them the phone number that had called me, he said that it was really weird for this to be happening in our town, which is a relatively small town in my opinion. About an hour later, I got a call from the officer I had talked to. He found out some more information about these people that approached me. He called the number I gave him and posed as a friend of mine to get more information, and found out that they were trying to recruit me to work for them by traveling and earning money. It was even more sketchy when I was told this group has a website, a YouTube channel, you name it. The officer also tells me that the group is a pyramid scheme, which is illegal in the US and elsewhere. Basically, if you don't know what that is, it's a form of investment where a paying participant has to recruit 2 or more participants. Once these 2 people have been recruited, the people who talk them into joining get paid more money, and the newer people get paid less money. The interesting thing was the fact that I didn't get a creepy vibe from these customers. They were generally nice and friendly people. However, they almost seemed too nice not to be up to something, obviously. This happened to me a few days ago, and I'm still having panic attacks about it, and the managers at my store are hopefully going to gather us all together at one point soon to give us some tips if it happens again. Although it's currently not a part of our training and stuff we have to go through. The man I knew as my dad never existed. This is almost the sort of thing that's so off and so evil that no one would actually believe me. My friends know most of the story, but not the real gory details, only the gist of it. I guess I'll start at the beginning. I'll be writing as I remember the events, but I'll try to keep them in sequential order as best I can. Since my mother was pregnant with me, my father had control of our family's finances. All the money that both he and my mother earned, he could use and swap between bank accounts as he pleased. Since 2013, though, we'd been having some problems with money. Problems we shouldn't have been having. Both of my parents' jobs paid over $100,000 a year before tax. Yes, my brother and I both went to private schools. Still, nothing had changed, and we suddenly started having money troubles, seemingly for no reason. Fast forward to February of 2015. And my father had a heart attack. While he was in the hospital, my mom looked in his car to find a mountain of bills, which included final notices on the mortgage for our house. Our house was in collections at the bank. When I found out about this, the only thing I could do was go outside with my dog, Bailey, because I knew that if we were kicked out of the house, I'd likely never see him again, and he would be returned to the breeder we bought him from. This marked the beginning of my father's downfall. The time between then and October is all just a blur. I can remember a few instances of my mom and father fighting really loudly. At some point, my father ended up sleeping in the spare room, which was next to mine. Since about halfway through August, he'd not been able to work. He was having horrible chest pains, which we now know were rapid heart attacks, and yet he refused to go to the hospital or have us call an ambulance for him. On the 1st of October 2015, the monster who was my father died. Now, from what I've told you already, you may be thinking, your dad didn't seem so bad, why are you calling him a monster? Well, I'll tell you why. Now, just a warning, this may become a little bit hard to follow, as I've currently got all the stories in my head at once, and I'm just going to type them in the order of which I found out about them. So, here we go. Since 2003, my father had been having an affair with a woman from work. This fact is made worse when you find out that my brother was born in 2005. How did we find out about this, I hear you thinking? Well, my older sister, she was 24 at the time, was looking through his emails to find electronic bills for things like Foxtel, a TV service provider for those who don't know, the gas bill, and the electricity. While my sister was looking for these, she finds emails from this woman. If I need to, let's call her B, saying that my father had given her an STD. Going further back, B was talking about how good my father was the previous night. Now, this woman knew that my father was married, and she knew that he had children. How do we know this? My father was complaining about us to her through emails. This woman is also the reason we started having money problems. My father had bought her a diamond ring and was promising that he would leave my mother and marry her in June of 2016. My mom was always asking my father if they could go to the cinema for their wedding anniversaries, or for my mom's birthday, or even just for the hell of it, but he never took her. Why? Because he'd already seen the movies with B. My father was almost never home. On weekends, he'd be going to a second job, as he was calling it. On weekdays, he was working late. I'll give you one guess on what he was doing instead, or rather, who he was doing instead. He never did anything at all around the house except maybe wash the dishes once a week, and living without him isn't much different. My mom, my brother, and I almost always would go on holiday in September, and my mom had been saving up to do it for a while, and everything was booked, so we went. My sister was left home supervising my father. When we got back, my mom found bills for a dog feeding service from before any of his medical issues began biting him in the ass. The bills were for the dates when we were on holiday. Instead of staying home like he was supposed to, he paid someone else to feed Bailey and spent the 2 weeks at B's house. After talking about my father's behavior with a psychiatrist, we've come to the conclusion that my father was a sociopath. He was pretending to be the kind, funny, caring person I thought he was my entire life. He didn't even really care about me. He didn't even care about himself enough to lose some goddamn weight, because if he had, he would have never had the heart attack. This last little bit, I don't know too many details about. My mom hasn't told me about it in extreme detail, and I haven't even told my friends about this out of fear that I'll be judged for my father's actions. My father was a rapist. I don't know when, and I don't know who. This is all that my mom has told me, and she's told me not to say anything to anyone who knows me because I will more than likely be seen as a rapist by people who don't know the full story. Please don't judge me because of something my father did. He made his own decisions, and I could never do that to someone. But this, if nothing else, tells me that my dad was a lie. I know that some people will think that I'm just doing this to get attention, but frankly, typing this out has helped me a lot. Thanks for reading. It means a lot. This is my first time posting a story, and I was high at the time, so I'm gonna say it how I remember it happening. All names have been changed. I'm a 17-year-old Hispanic female, but at the time this happened I was 14, and this took place in Texas. I had recently gotten out of a mental health hospital and was diagnosed with chronic depression, bulimia, and body dysmorphia. So the only way I felt loved or appreciated was by having sex with older men and doing drugs. It was summer and I was about to start high school. I was invited to a party with some of my older friends, Vanessa, Callie, and Jackie. I knew my mom wasn't going to let me go to a party after I got caught having sex with a 20-year-old at my cousin's quinceañera, so I lied and said I was going to spend the night at one of my friends' houses. She wound up letting me go and even let me stay over there for 2 days, since I hadn't left the house after getting out of the hospital. I thanked her and went to my room and got my stuff ready. A few hours later, my friend Vanessa picked me up and my mom gave me $45 just in case we went shopping or wanted to order pizza. As soon as I got in her car, I smelled weed. She smiled at me with low red eyes and threw a pack of strawberry swishers and some weed and told me to roll one for us. I did, and we went to pick up our other friends. After we got Jackie, we went to Callie's house to get dressed, and then we were on our way. We were smoking the blunt I rolled except Vanessa, who was driving and didn't want to get high when it got dark. I was pretty high, and I didn't realize that we had left town and were heading towards Dallas. When we got there, I found it odd that it was just me, my 3 friends, and Jackie's boyfriend, who was 21, and she was 17. I didn't say anything, thinking that there were going to be more people coming later. At the time, all I had really done was smoke weed and drink. My friends knew that, so they told me I didn't have to do anything else if I wasn't ready. But I wanted to seem cool in front of them and Jackie's boyfriend since I was getting bored just sitting there drinking while Callie and Vanessa were snorting coke. They told me that they had a dealer that could give them an 8-ball, which is an eighth of a gram, for $80. They called up the guy and said that they can meet him up at his place since he was on house arrest. We got into Jackie's boyfriend's car, let's call him Quan, since he had a van and we could all fit. We were on our way and Callie was rolling up another blunt. I got higher that night than I had ever been in my life. They told me this was the strongest strain they have ever had too, and to just relax so nobody would trip out. I was giggling at nothing and my entire body felt like I was vibrating and I felt like we were floating. When we got there, I could barely walk. My legs felt like jello, so Callie helped me walk since she needed help walking too. We knocked and went inside. I think there were about 6 guys all in their mid-20s. One guy caught my attention. He looked out of place. He was dressed way better than the other guys and was very attractive. I guess he noticed me too and came up and started to talk to me. He asked me what my name was and my age. I told him the truth and his eyes got big. I felt awkward and I asked him how old he was.
I'm 24, but don't worry, I'm not a pedo,
he said with a chuckle. I didn't care since I had been with 20-year-olds before. I looked over at my friends and they were laughing and talking to the guy who was on house arrest, talking about why he was on house arrest, but I didn't pay attention. The 24-year-old asked me if I wanted to sit down on the couch with him. My legs still felt like jello, so I nodded and sat down. He sat down next to me and said,
I'm Kodak, by the way.
I smiled and he scooted closer. I guess he noticed that I was tensing up and he said,
I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, mommy. I just think you are a fine little Spanish girl.
I felt myself blushing and I said, No, it's okay. I'm not uncomfortable, I'm just really high and I feel like time is going in slow motion. He laughed and I felt stupid for saying that.
Do you want to go to my room and lay down for a sec?
I said sure, not wanting to make a fool out of myself in front of the other guys there. I told my friends I'll be back as they said okay and kept talking and laughing. I was holding onto the wall and he said,
Don't worry, baby girl, I got you.
And grabbed me by my waist and took me to his room. I sat on his bed and he sat next to me. I could tell he wanted to kiss me by how close he was to my face and his hand rubbing my thigh. I really wasn't in the mood for more than kissing, so I just kissed him, hoping he would be satisfied with that and let me rest. He stood up and I thought that was it. My eyes were very low, so I didn't notice him taking off his shirt until I heard his belt being undone and I looked up at him and he smiled at me. I couldn't understand what was going on. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't. He took off his pants and got on top of me. He kissed me and was touching me. As soon as he tried unbuttoning my jeans, I screamed. He put his hand over my mouth and my friends were too busy laughing in the living room. He told me to shut up or he was going to shoot my brains out. I bit his hand hard and he hit me in the side of the head with something. This is where I blacked out for a few minutes or seconds. I couldn't tell. I woke up only to see him putting on a condom and being almost completely naked. He didn't know I was conscious again, and I got up and tried to run, but my underwear was still around my ankles. He saw me get up and tried to run after me, but he was looking for something in the covers. I managed to pull up my underwear and grab my jeans and ran out screaming. My friends were in shock, and the guy who was on house arrest looked shocked too. They all paused to look at me, and I told them he tried to rape me. And he came out of his room stumbling on my shoes wearing only black gym shorts and socks. That's when we all ran for the door and went outside. Quan grabbed his keys out of his pocket and we all jumped in. Callie was the last one to get in, and as soon as she closed the door, we heard 2 gunshots and bolted out of there. I was crying hysterically and they were trying to calm me down. We drove fast and when we were at a stoplight, something hit us from the back. It was Kodak and his friends with guns out of their black car. They had been following us with their headlights on. I screamed at Quan to hurry, and he did. We swerved and ended up losing them on a busy street.
Let's just go back to my house and you girls get back home. I'll switch cars and follow you guys behind, just in case,
said Quan. I didn't want to argue, and I just wanted to go back to Vanessa's house and sleep everything off. We got to his house, and Callie, Jackie, and I went into Vanessa's car while he switched cars to an old beat-up black Acura. Quan followed us home, and thankfully the other guys didn't follow us. We took the long way back to Arlington and took lots of turns just in case. Quan wound up staying with us until it was around 2 a.m. and he was tired. We got into Vanessa's house, and being the hippie she is, she made me some lavender and chamomile tea. We went into Vanessa's room upstairs so we wouldn't wake up her parents. Once we sat down, she asked me what happened, and I told her and Quan everything. Then Quan said,
I know why they followed us.
We all looked at him as he pulled out about an ounce of cocaine from his hoodie. He had slipped it in his pocket when they all turned around to look at me when I came out screaming. "You dumbass! We could have gotten killed!" said Jackie. He had just stolen over $1,000 in cocaine. That's why they went after us. We got calls and threats for weeks because of that. It eventually stopped when Jackie called and left an anonymous tip to the police, and they all got arrested. Till this day, I haven't told my parents what happened, and I still have nightmares about that night. This incident is tough for me to talk about. I am a 27-year-old male and was living in New Hampshire at the time, in an extremely safe town. I lived alone with my dog Toby during this time and worked 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. Sharing a duplex was new to me and quite different, especially when your neighbors were very odd. It was a lady in her 60s and a younger man in his 30s. I believed they were mother and son. Because they wouldn't speak to me, I actually had no clue. I tried making small talk, but neither of them said a word. The mother looked beat down with gray hair, and she wore the same blue nightgown every time I saw her. I would see the son smoking outside wearing the same white wife beater since I moved in 7 months prior. It was a summer night in July around 11 p.m., and I let Toby out in the backyard. Now, mind you, I share a backyard with these creeps. Toby was running around, and I heard the neighbors slide the door open. I saw the younger man in his wife beater walk out onto the deck, and he gave me a death stare. My heart dropped, and I began feeling extreme anxiety. I saw him reach in his pocket, and he pulled out a gun. He pointed it at Toby and fired 4 times. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life. The man ran inside and closed the door. I began sprinting towards Toby, but he fled into the woods. I immediately called 911 and told them what happened. The police arrived in 5 minutes and surrounded our duplex. They placed me in a police car and asked me to recount what happened. My dog Toby never barked and was the most behaved puppy ever, so he had no excuse to shoot him. The cops were outside about 15 minutes until they heard 3 gunshots. They rushed inside and found the mother and son deceased, both by bullet wounds. Come to find later, the son had shot his mother twice and committed suicide with a single shot to the head. Later that night, Toby came back and was shot in his back leg. After a couple surgeries, he came back brand new. This was the most horrific thing I have ever witnessed. So, I'm a female, and this happened when I was around 12. First, some backstory. I had this neighbor that lived down the street from me. For a couple months, he lived with his dad because he couldn't afford his own place. No problem. Yet. Until he started staring, peeking, and looking into windows of houses. The horrifying part is no one knew why. Probably to look at naked women, but he had been caught many times. The police were called on him multiple times, and he was arrested on a handful of occasions for smaller problems. Well, while this was going on, rumors spread that he was lurking around the neighborhood, so parents became hesitant to let their kids outside to play. Now, one day, I met him face to face. I was walking home from my grandparents' house, who lived just a short walking distance away, with my younger brother, who was 10. We were just walking and talking about how the day was going. So we were walking home, and it was close to a 5-minute walk back to our house. Once we finally turn the corner to our small cul-de-sac, we see the man's car drive by. The whole neighborhood was on watch for him. I whisper to my brother, "That's," he says, "No way, really?" And him being the smart, invincible 10-year-old he was, he yells, "Yo!" to his moving car with the windows down. Not thinking he really heard us, I gave him a stern smack in the head and told him to keep walking. Meanwhile, the man turns his car around and starts to follow us. I finally notice in disbelief and scream, "Run!" And we run into my mother's arms. She was waiting for us in the garage, not noticing what happened. The man did a loop with his car into the cul-de-sac and left going the way he came. He now knew where we lived. That night, we all huddled nervous that he was lurking around the home. He never came back, as far as we know. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for showing his male parts to a woman in Walmart. He was put in jail for about a year and is now back in our neighborhood, selling drugs and so on. Many rumors have spread that he lured many underage girls to his house, but no one knows if that's true or not. So that's where I sit today, wondering, always wondering what happened to him, and always looking over my shoulder. So this happened in 2013. This kid named Ricky moved in next door to me, and he was around 12. For lack of a better term, this kid was pretty much a pussy. I remember one time he fell on his skateboard and he didn't land hard at all and was crying his little heart out in my driveway, and he was like 16 at the time. So fast forward to when this kid is like 18. By then, I'm selling coke and molly pretty heavily, and he's one of my best customers. By now, he's hanging with some pretty shady people, which my parents obviously aren't fans of. My parents also didn't know I was ever selling anything, because I was pretty good at keeping it under wraps. Ricky was clearly a follower. He went from the skater emo type to some wannabe thug, which he just wasn't built for. So my parents go on vacation to the Outer Banks of North Carolina every year for 2 weeks, and they always ask if I'll come stay at their house while they're gone. I was excited about this because their house is much better than the shitty little one-bedroom apartment I had at the time. So everything was going fine at the house. I had my on and off again girlfriend over all the time, and there was quite a bit of drugs and alcohol going on. I was far from a saint back then. I'll never forget it. It was a Thursday night. My girl had left a few hours ago. I should say, earlier that day, Ricky had seen me outside of my parents' house and had asked me for a front. I told him no, considering I never fronted anyone, and in all honesty, I had been using too much of my own shit, so I couldn't afford to do so anyway. He didn't like that very much, and we got in an argument, and I pretty much punked him in front of all his little friends. So, by now, it's 2 in the morning, and I'm obviously nowhere near tired because of all the coke and molly I had been doing. I'm sitting in the dark watching Netflix in this den side living room my parents had in the downstairs, which has a window going outside, which I had open. I had paused the TV and was on my phone texting and on Facebook when I hear something. It's the screen of my window slowly being slid up. I know the sound. I had snuck in and out of this house numerous times growing up. So I slowly get up and watch the window. I clearly see the screen moving very slowly up through the curtains. So I walk up to the window, and as soon as I move the curtain, at least 3 or 4 people scatter. I run out front, but by the time I get out there, they are booking it down the street. I knew it was that Ricky kid and his friends. I didn't see them, but I knew it was those shitheads. I didn't call the cops or anything, because I wasn't exactly living on the right side of the law. So I just went back inside and locked everything up, and the rest of the week went by smoothly. I never told my parents about it, and I also never saw Ricky again. I had called him a few times, which he never answered, which was all the more reason to know it was him, and he knew that I knew. So a month after the incident, I'm watching the news, and Ricky is on it for murder, which blows my mind. Him and 3 of his friends went out of town and broke into some old couple's home, beat them, tied them up, and stabbed them. Then they burnt the house down after robbing it. They all ended up telling on each other, and Ricky got sentenced to 35 years for testifying against his co-defendants. It makes me wonder if I was asleep when they got in, what could have happened. There's a link to the news article related to this story in the description. I literally just remembered this guy, so I am quickly writing it down here so I don't forget. For a little background, this happened in Florida between 2004 and 2006. Yeah, I'm an early 2000s kid. So I'm a female and was around 5 to 7 years old at the time. My older sister was just a few years older than me. I am a French American and grew up overseas, so visiting my grandparents in America had always been an interesting experience. The neighbor was a very old skinny man from what I can remember, and he had a wife. We never really saw the wife much, besides her trimming the hedges and occasionally staring at my sister and I while we ran around the backyard. To make sense for the following events, my grandparents used to live in the neighbor's house, so when my grandparents moved, they just went one house over. I remember having had left a few toys in that old house, and I always wanted to go over there in my own time to try and get them back. This never happened. I remember on several accounts this old man would try and coax my older sister and I into his house. Sometimes he would try this with us both at once, and other times he would try to get us individually to enter his house. I was just a little kid at the time, but I do remember certain things in detail. There was this one encounter with our neighbor that I'll never forget. One time I was playing out in the backyard looking for lizards and whatnot when I saw the neighbor waving at me. I remember watching him for a bit before trotting over to him. He seemed to be signaling for me to come into his garage. Right before I did so, my older sister appeared behind me and grabbed my hand. She told me off for almost going onto our neighbor's property. When I told her what happened, I remember she looked over at him. The old man began to say things like,
"Your dog is in my garage. She wandered in here. Come get your dog. I'll even give you two some candy,"
and stuff like that. After a few minutes of this, I had grown kind of bored and sat down on the grass. I remember my older sister leaning down a bit to speak in my ear, and she said something like, "When I say so, we run. Got it?" I just nodded in return, wondering why we would need to run. As my older sister stared the man down, he soon began to start walking out of his garage. The neighbor began to talk about Candy, our dog, and other things while he began to approach us. I remember looking at him in confusion as the man began to approach us. Seeing this, my sister whispered, "Now!" to me as we both began to book it back to the house, with the man screaming at us to come back. Once we ran inside, my older sister told my parents what happened, and they confirmed we should never talk to the man ever again. Oh, and by the way, our dog was in the house the entire time. She was fine. At the time, I just thought it was a weird encounter and tossed it aside. Several times after that, I remember the neighbor trying to get me to follow him inside when I had gone looking for golf balls and had wandered too close to his house. This always ended in me tempting death and waiting till he was a few seconds away from grabbing me before I darted back to the house. Either that or my older sister would come rescue me. When I was around 9 years old, the old man died. I don't really remember why, but I think it was something to do with his heart. To be honest, at the time, I didn't care at all. I was happy he was gone, and so was my older sister. Finally, we wouldn't get creeped out anymore. After his death, his son came and got his wife, and they moved out. Now that I think about it, this was very creepy, but at the time I didn't think about it much, I guess. What I wonder about now is why did he want my older sister and I to come into his house and garage? Why did he lie to us about the dog? What was he planning to do with us? I live in Vermont now, but I'm originally from Massachusetts. After completing school, I moved up here. I found a place for cheap on Craigslist and came up to check it out and decided to move in. The landlord seemed okay. He was a short 60-year-old white guy, down to earth, honest about the condition of the place, and nice enough. He would hit on me every now and then, but myself, coming from a very rough upbringing, I just shook it off and decided I'd keep my distance from him and keep our meetings strictly business. Let's call the landlord Paul. So Paul lives downstairs and I live upstairs, now along with 4 other people who also rent from him. Months go by and everything seems normal. The house is tiny and in bad shape, but I figure it's my first apartment. What do I expect on a student's salary? The 3rd month comes around, and I invite my then-girlfriend over. It's 7 a.m. on a Saturday. We're laying in bed sleeping and snuggling. Then all of a sudden the silence is shattered by Paul, yelling in the hallway, drunk as a skunk.
I don't care if you're a pussy eater or a cocksucker. Don't cook and then walk away. Don't cook and then walk away.
Paul goes on to elaborate as best as he can that someone had left the stove on and he was afraid a fire would start. My girlfriend looks at me horrified as Paul continues in the background.
I don't care if you're a pussy eater.
My girlfriend and I look at each other scared and horrified. This had never happened before, and by the banging he was making, we thought he might try to break in or something. Paul then finishes.
Or a cocksucker. You don't cook, burn the fucking house down.
Needless to say, she didn't really want to come up and visit very much after we learned what kind of drunk Paul is. An angry one. 3 months later, it's 9 a.m., this time on a Sunday. It's just me this time, and I'm sleeping in bed when again from the hallway, it's Paul, and he's drunk again.
Whoever, whatever, took a shit in my house and didn't flush, go clean up your shit. You're going to come into my house, take a shit, then not flush the toilet in my house?
So apparently one of my neighbors took a dump while drunk or half asleep or something and clogged the toilet. All I know is what I heard from Paul in the hallway. I should note that when he does this, he often bangs on people's doors at all hours. Sometimes this happens in the middle of the night, but I am always too tired to remember those. And sometimes he even breaks into people's rooms and harasses them. One of my neighbors has a sign on her door that was written just for him. I'll include a picture. And my door I actually reinforced so no one can just beat it down. This isn't even the last time this happened. This guy lives for this, I swear. October 2018. Paul must have gotten so drunk he thought it was Christmas, or he fell asleep drunk watching Scrooge because, sure enough, 2 a.m. rolls around. I was actually up at this time, prepping to start a night shift job in town. I am sitting at my desk working when I start to hear chains rattling. Then I hear banging. I immediately get up and head over to the door to see what the hell is going on, but then the yelling starts. And once I hear it's Paul, I immediately freeze, turn back around, and head back to my desk. This wasn't new at this point, so I just dimmed the lights, kept quiet, and listened. We had been dealing with someone in the house stealing from others lately, to the extent of Paul looking at security cameras to buy. He also left nasty notes littered with curse words addressed to this random thief all around the house. Paul doesn't write notes, though. We know this. No. Paul hits the beer fridge. Then he hits the walls. This time with a chain.
Thief in my house? 4 fucking rules. I gave you 4 fucking rules to follow. Pay me, don't stink, don't bring 5-0 here, and don't touch what ain't yours. 4 fucking rules.
Those were the 4 house rules he puts in his Craigslist ad, and he's tearing up his own hallway with a chain at this point.
You think I give a fuck about this house? I don't give a fuck about this house. I'll go sleep in a tent, tear this fucking house down and sell the land. I'll go live out of my garage.
He ranted on and on for what seemed like forever. Then he went downstairs and started banging down there. For the record, we never found the thief, and stuff still goes missing. As comical as Paul's antics are, they are legit frightening the first few times you deal with this. As I told my ex, he's harmless. He's crazy as shit, but harmless. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a pedophile. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake, where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time. But what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was one house between his place and ours, something I am very grateful for. I don't know what life would have been like if we had to live right next to him. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, that we were never, ever allowed to do it by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street when we got to his place, just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. My mom said that before we ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s, early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us and do terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer regularly molested their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process, he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had 2 daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way and grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her children going to live with Grandpa. More on that in a moment. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents the gossip and Mr. Stan's history with children, which, understandably, horrified them both. As a result, my mom and dad were very wary of him from the start. Mr. Stan was cordial enough. He would wave hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to Mom, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, which my parents politely but empathetically declined. Then, sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up the street. My dad is a chatty person, so he asked Lana what she was up to. Lana told him she was going to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all, and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to my mom, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately towards her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around Mr. Stan. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mom told me that it was so disturbing to see the sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mom and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they would be putting themselves at risk, and the rest of the neighborhood was no help. Mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won out, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal at my elementary school. The principal, in turn, called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it was leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it, and as Mom put it, that's when the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly towards my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life and he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we begun living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details to this story, but sadly, it doesn't end there. After we moved out of the cul-de-sac, Lana and the other girls who were now grown up came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one he could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things he'd done. I have no memory of the proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedophile. He knew he would not last long if he went to prison. So, on a quiet morning 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and shot himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot. Mom tells me the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event, but one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs to the front door were all underneath the wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster house, though I didn't know why at the time. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's front door once. It was Halloween, and my parents decided it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy, and I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was so nice. But what I remember most was that I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this has still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan in a wife-beater top, beer belly and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at us. For years I wondered if that was what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong. I couldn't sense the tension that my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go to the lake. But now that I come to think of it, Mr. Stan may have been the reason my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I'm so thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. This story could have gone very differently. When I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac, it's usually the happy memories I think of first. Mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she nor Dad regret the decisions they made. She left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know it. Some context. I'm a 19-year-old college student, and earlier this year, I decided to create a Grindr profile because why the hell not? I'm single, and I may as well be a dumb college student while I'm a dumb college student. My friends and I were studying late one night in their dorm room, like always. All of my close friends lived together in the dorms, so their lounge was the primary hangout spot. It was a little after midnight, and I went on Grindr. At this point, I had been on the app for 2 months and had gone on a fair amount of dates. When I opened the app, I had received a message from a guy. I don't remember his name, so I'll just continue to refer to him as the guy. I clicked on his profile, and he was a pretty cute guy. He had a shirtless picture, which was common, and he was attractive enough for me to get more information on him. His caption read, "In town for work." I read his bio, and he explained that he was in town for work, that he was staying at a nearby hotel, and was able to host visitors there. I replied to his message and began the typical Grindr talk. How are you? What are you into? Can you host? Etc. After talking for about a half hour or so and exchanging pictures, we agreed to meet. I must say that I did not get any indication that this guy was a catfish or that I was talking to someone who wasn't who they said they were. It's usually pretty obvious when someone isn't who they say they are. That's what I told myself at least. Whenever I decide to meet up with a guy, I always tell one of my friends and then share my location with them. I do this and then I head out. The hotel was about 10 minutes away from my university. As I was driving there, the guy messaged me and asked,
Hey, so my business partner might come back soon. Would it be cool if we did stuff in your car?
It's not an unusual request to engage in car play, but I did start to be a bit suspicious. Why would his business partner be out this late? Yet again, here I was out this late, so I brushed it off and continued making my way to the hotel. I arrived to the hotel, and I would say it was about 1 a.m. at this point. I looked at my phone, and again I had received another message from this guy. He said,
Pull around to the back of the hotel.
I drove into the parking lot and made my way to the back of the hotel, past the pool. This is when things started to get weird. As I pulled into the back of this hotel parking lot, I noticed a guy in a red hoodie in between some cars. Assuming it was the guy I'd been messaging, I pulled into one of the spots underneath a light post, about 20 feet in front of a dumpster that sat in the corner of the parking lot. By this point, the guy in the red hoodie had gone out of sight. I instinctually clicked on the button to lock my doors. I checked the app and had received another message from the guy that said,
Pull back next to the dumpster.
I assumed that since I was underneath the light, he was worried that we'd be caught if a guest or hotel staff saw us. At this point, I started to get a bit sketched out, but I figured that maybe my anxiety was just getting the best of me. I put my car into reverse and pulled back next to the dumpster and put my car in park. At this point, I'm scanning the parking lot for this guy, and I don't see anyone. No sight of the guy in the red hoodie either. I feel my heart rate suddenly increase, and I begin getting cold sweats. Maybe I shouldn't have driven out here, I remember thinking to myself. Then I checked the app again, and I received another message from the guy.
Turn your car off and get into the back seat.
Okay, it is at this point that my fight or flight response kicked in because, without thinking, I immediately turned on my car and hauled ass out of there. I sped out of that parking lot as fast as my poor 2004 car could go. I didn't even stop to check for incoming traffic when I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road. I drove about 2 miles up the road away from the hotel and pulled into a McDonald's parking lot. At this point, I'm trembling, but I'm thinking maybe I just overreacted. I checked the app again to see if the guy messaged me anything. I was expecting a what the fuck, but the messages from the guy were gone. I'm assuming he blocked me, which leads me to believe that whatever he had planned was not good at all. Was he trying to jump me, steal my car, or maybe something worse? Needless to say, I deleted the app after this incident. To everyone who uses any sort of dating app, be careful who you meet, where you meet, and just take precautions. Our parents told us never to talk to strangers for a reason. I am a single Christian woman in my 20s, and since I don't have many friends in my local church, I decided to sign up to a website where I can make friends online. Some of the site members also used it for the purpose of dating, which was okay with me as I was open to possibilities. Soon I met a guy there who seemed nice and we had some interests in common. and after a few months of friendship, we began to Skype since we lived far away from each other and couldn't meet up in person. We began chatting, and he seemed okay, but every now and then he would pause, go quiet, and just stare into the webcam. When I told him it was creepy and asked why he was doing it, he replies that he enjoys sharing the silence. I wasn't sure if that was normal, and since around the same time I was busy dating someone else, I avoided the guy for several months. However, when I broke up with my ex, I was feeling lonely and decided I wouldn't mind chatting to a friend to take my mind off things. The guy happened to be the only person available. We ended up chatting every couple of days for about 2 weeks, and I even started getting used to the uncomfortable silence and staring when things got weirder. During our conversations, I found out that the guy was in his 30s and still a virgin, and we both agreed that we believe in sex only after marriage. So it came to me as a surprise when one day he confessed that he has a fetish for girls in school uniforms. He asked if he could send me an erotic schoolgirl outfit with a very short miniskirt because he wanted to see me wearing it. I said no, since I don't like wearing revealing clothes. Another time, he showed up in his bed on the webcam, only wearing his underwear, and began to ask me more dirty questions. I just laughed and made a few jokes and then tried to change the subject. However, he was not very responsive to the conversation, instead preferring to stare at his screen into the webcam, grinning, while making repetitive motions with his hand under his bed cover. I didn't want to see it, so I made an excuse and left. I should have completely stopped chatting with him after that, but the next day and the next day he repeatedly texted me wanting to go on the webcam. Since I was bored and lonely, I asked him to promise me he wouldn't be naked and do dirty things, and he agreed. For a couple of days we managed to carry on chatting, but soon after he did it again, and this time it was much worse. First, he asked me to touch myself and sent him a recording of it. I refused, explaining to him that in case my computer ever gets hacked, I do not want such things to be seen anywhere on the internet.
Oh, but you don't have to make a video. I just want to listen to the noises you make,
he replied. Again, I refused, saying that it made me uncomfortable, but he would not take no for an answer. He took off his underwear and began touching himself as if he was stroking a pet while grinning at me with that big, creepy smile. I told him I had to go and terminated the video call. That same evening, I sent a long message explaining why I don't think we would be compatible with each other and said that I found him disrespectful and want to stop seeing him. He responded saying that I am stuck in the past, only thinking about my ex who used me, even though the guy had no idea what went on between me and my ex. At that, I got angry and told him not to speak to me about it again. So pervy guy, let's not meet again. Just for some background info, I'm an 18-year-old male currently living in New York. I'm 6'4" and buff. I've always been the center of ridicule and teasing from a young age due to my size. Just for some context, I stopped growing in 9th grade, 4 years ago. I was already done with puberty and had a full-on beard and was adult-like. I took advantage of this, sometimes too much, which led me to losing my virginity in the 9th grade to a girl who was in college. This story takes place when I was in 10th grade. I was lonely after a breakup with my girlfriend of 7 months. I was looking for a one-night stand, so I turned to Tinder. I set up a fake profile, but with my real picture, and waited. There was this gorgeous girl whom I matched with. This girl was too good to be true, which gave me the first red flag, yet I went along with it anyway. We exchanged innocent messages and planned to meet at her place the next day around 9 p.m. I wasn't as excited as you would think because I had some doubts about this girl because I didn't know if she was real. So 9 p.m. rolls around and I get ready to go to her place. I mentally prepared myself if anything crazy was going to go down. Before I left, I texted my dad saying I was going to a friend's house and I was on my way. I asked my good friend Isaac, who was 6 years my senior, to drive me since he had a car. He warned me to be cautious. Long story short, he drives me up to her apartment and I ring the doorbell. I hear light footsteps behind the door and a high-pitched voice saying, "Be right there." That's when I texted my friend telling him everything is fine and he should leave. Boy, was I wrong. The door opens to the girl in the picture. I immediately felt excited, which didn't last for long. On my Tinder account, I wrote that I was 24, when really I was only 15. She, not knowing this, swiftly asked me if I wanted a drink. I said I didn't want anything, which visibly made her facial expression turn from happy to pissed off. I realized that maybe I was going to be drugged, and I was not about to take any chance, so I asked to go to the bathroom. She then, out of the blue, said sure happily. Again, her weird response confirmed my theory in my head. I go to the bathroom and quickly text my friend to come back and pick me up. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see a figure dressed in all black standing in the shower, trying to hide behind the curtain. The figure saw me looking at him because not even 2 seconds after, he lunged at me. I was scared shitless even though I was massively taller than this man. He tried pushing me to the floor, yet to no avail. I overpowered him too vastly. I grabbed him by the shirt and looked him in the eye. He was around 5'10", sorta buff, mid-30s, bald, and looked to be of Russian descent. I pushed him on the floor and cursed him out. He tells me to fuck myself, which is when I punched him in the face. There I was, a 15-year-old in a bathroom with a knocked-out man. I panicked, but I kept my cool and took out my phone and took many photos of the man. By then, my friend texted me and told me he was outside of the building waiting for me. Then, the girl opened the door to the bathroom and started to scream. I pushed her with all my power and sprinted the hell out of that apartment. When I got to my friend's car, I frantically explained to him what happened. Only then did I realize that I could have been drugged, killed, or worse. I obviously took screenshots of her profile and the messages between us. Even though I had all the proof in the world to lock those assholes up, I didn't because I was scared of my parents and lying to them. Moral of the story, be very cautious when dating online. I lived in an apartment with my mom and sister for 10 years, and well, the place was haunted. When my dad was still with my mom, he would tell us about how, when he slept, sometimes he would wake up to something grabbing his chest. My sister and I eventually switched rooms with my parents. The strange occurrences that would happen, we always thought were our parents because they were funny and liked to play jokes like that, like moving toys into different positions on the stairs and so on, but it turns out they weren't. Then my sister started to tell me that there was a boy in the hallway watching her, and in our kitchen, stuff started falling out of the cabinets and our trash can would open by itself. Things got worse when we got the bunk bed. The top bunk was mine, and the bottom bunk was vacant since my sister had her own bed. In front of the beds was a huge closet mirror, and I looked at it in the middle of the night, and I saw a man looking at me from the bottom bunk, and I was scared, but I could only see the back of him, and he was tall, but I don't really remember what he looked like, except he was balding. When I saw him, I whispered for my sister, and I asked if she saw what I was seeing, and I looked at her face in the reflection, and she was just as shocked and freaked out as I was. I jumped down onto my sister's bed, and she held me, and when we looked back, he wasn't there. We both really don't know what happened that night, but we both vividly remember the incident and often bring it up in conversation. Ghosts have been a fascination of mine ever since. Please, someone help us. We don't know what to do. It's getting so bad, and in the 20 years I've lived here, this is by far the worst. Both my parents grew up in haunted houses, and of course my siblings and I have grown up in haunted houses as well. At first, my parents thought my brothers just had an imaginary friend in their closet named Joe. One of my brothers woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and I was a baby, so I don't remember, but my parents have told me about it. My parents ran in there, and he had blood all over his sheets and 3 very long cuts down his back. My brothers had bunk beds, and my other brother was on the bottom. My parents said he was so pale, and he wouldn't say a word. Things calmed down for a really long time, until I was about 10. I had one of my friends staying over, and we were staying up really late playing games and doing what little girls do. We started to hear scratching coming from the outside of my door, and I had a cat, so I thought it was her. I went to open it, but no one was there, so we just shrugged it off. Then it started again, and the doorknob started to jiggle, and it slowly opened, and there was a dark figure standing there. It looked like it was out of breath, and its shoulders were going up and down. Then it lunged at us, and we screamed, and my parents came running. Nothing, or nobody, was in the house. My friend never stayed over again, and stopped being my friend shortly after. 9 years later, just little things were happening, nothing too scary. My boyfriend, now husband, went off to basic training and I still lived with my parents. I was only 19. I had my dog Zeus and he was sleeping on my bed with me. He was a yellow lab. It was about 6:30 in the morning and I had to be up at 8:30 for work. He woke me up by growling and then I heard a weird voice in my ear, speaking a language I didn't understand. When I started to open my eyes, it started growling in my ear. I opened my eyes fast and my door slammed. My dog was standing over me with his hair standing up, looking like he was about to attack something. Another time, everyone had gone to work and I heard banging coming from my parents' room. I got Zeus off me, I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room. Cabinets were opening and closing fast and things were getting thrown everywhere around the room, and it wouldn't stop. I slammed the door shut and ran out. My dog was now running around the house barking and growling, and then he started running into my parents' door. I said fuck it, grabbed my work clothes, got my dog, and ran the hell out of there. I dropped my dog off at my friend's and went to work early. When I got home, my parents' room was destroyed. My mother was crying and my dad was pissed. I told them everything. We decided not to talk about it again and went on with the rest of the day. My brother still lived with my parents as well. That night, my door kept opening and closing and I kept hearing running in the hallway, so I thought it was him. I slipped on my slippers and stomped into his room. I was going to yell at him to knock off his stupid shit, but when I opened the door, he was snoring. I woke him up and made him promise it wasn't him. He told me to leave his door open to see if he sees anything. I'm halfway down the hallway and my brother yelled at me to run back to my room and to not look back, but of course I turned around, and as I turned around I see a large black figure standing in his doorway, staring at me. It had large red eyes, just staring at me. I froze and started to whimper. My brother, being the protective big brother, came charging, telling the thing to leave me alone, and when he got to it, it disappeared. My brother ran to me and led me to my room, and slept on the floor that night so he could stay with me. I didn't sleep. Now, a year later, I'm 20 and my husband is away for the army at the moment, and we're waiting for plumbing to get done in our new house, so I'm still staying with my parents. Last night, we had a bad rainstorm. I woke up to the growling again, but I couldn't move. Out of the corner of my eye, there was the figure with the red eyes again, just staring at me. Thunder started and it opened its mouth so wide it could fit my whole head inside. It had huge sharp teeth and a long skinny tongue. It started to scream and my ears started to ring. I wanted to cover them, but I couldn't. My dog was half growling and half whining at it. My parents came running in, covering their ears, but stopped mid-run when they saw the thing. My dad came running to me anyway and picked me up and carried me to his room with my dog following. Zeus had his back to us so he could face the thing and never took his eyes off the figure until it was out of sight. I was finally able to move and I started crying and shaking uncontrollably. My brother was still living at home as well, and he had his girlfriend over that night. We heard her scream and then she started banging on the door, so my dad opened it and she came in running and crying and shaking. We started to ask where Mike, my brother, was. Before she could answer, my brother came out of his room on his hands and feet with black eyes just staring at us. We all froze and none of us knew what to do. My brother then popped his neck and started running for us. My dad slammed the door shut and locked it. My brother started to run against it. My mom was screaming for him to get the hell out of her house and just kept repeating this while throwing things and stomping, and then things went quiet. My dad opened the door and my brother was passed out on the floor with his nose bleeding. When my brother woke up, we told him everything. He didn't remember anything. He just remembered hearing screaming and then it all went black. He told us all sorry and then stayed quiet for the rest of the night. Nobody slept and we all called into work to try and figure something out. Now it's the next night and it's 11 at night. We are hearing scratching and growling through the house. We can't do this again. Please, help. This happened in 2011 when I was 7. I'm a girl, now 14, and I just talked to my mother about this incident and decided to share it. So I lived with my grandmother, father, mother, and 2 dogs quite far away from any town. The house was big, so I usually would play hide and seek with my mom a lot. I don't remember which month it was, so my mom filled me in on this. She said it was October during the holidays. This one particular day, my dad was out driving my grandma to the hospital as she had an appointment with the doctor, so I was left alone with my mom. After several rounds of hide and seek and watching a movie with my mom, it began to get dark outside and my dad still wasn't home. I've always been scared of potential home invasions, so I was paranoid all day because my dad wasn't with us. He made me feel very safe. Fast forward an hour. Me and my mom decided to play Monopoly. When I was 7, I thought I was very sly, so I kept stealing money from my mom's stash. Now that I look back, she was probably pretending not to see. As I was taking a $50 bill from her Monopoly cash, she said, "The power will go out soon." This left me completely puzzled as I had no idea how she'd know this. But sure enough, it went out about 15 minutes later, and I started to panic because, as most little kids, I'm scared of the dark. I later found out that there was a power outage in my area because of a storm, and my mom was notified of it. She handed me this Nokia phone and let me play my favorite game on it. She told me to go hide under the bed sheets if I'm scared and that she'll be back soon. I asked where she was going, and she didn't answer. As she headed out of the room, she locked the door. I laid under the sheets, killing some monsters in the game for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 5 minutes. I heard footsteps in the kitchen, which was next to the room I was in, so I pulled the sheets off my head and yelled out, "Mom?" I was so glad she was back because I was really scared, but I heard no answer from her. The footsteps didn't stop, so I yelled again, "Mom, can you please come? I'm scared." After I had said that, the footsteps stopped completely. I got a sudden rush of adrenaline, so I held tight onto the phone, unlocked the door, as there's keys on the inside of the room too, and ran out into the kitchen, which was empty. I was left puzzled, but I didn't wait for long. I ran out into the corridor. Alright, so the corridor has 4 doors on the right side, one at the very back, which I never was allowed to go in. I later learned that that room was where my great-grandma died, and no one touched it ever since. It also had stairs next to it leading to the 2nd floor, and one at the front which led to the outside. The 4th door was a closet. I quickly opened the outside door ready to run out, but the rush of adrenaline was gone and I got scared of the outside too. It was very dark and I was barely able to see. My only choices were 1, go back to the room I came from, 2, scream for my mother. I chose number 2 and started screaming for my mom over and over again. I guess I wasn't loud enough because there were no replies. I remember I started to sweat and panic with different scenarios playing through my little head. Scenarios like a murderer killing my mom and coming for me next, or my mom leaving forever. I know, stupid, but I was only 7 after all. I remember looking down at my feet and beginning to cry. More footsteps were heard, but this time behind me. I looked behind me and saw a silhouette of a tall person. I am assuming it was a male due to the body build, at the end of the hallway, standing in front of the door. I can't recall what he looked like because he was all black. I stared at him for about 15 seconds in pure horror. This got my adrenaline pumping again, and I ran out the door towards the outside toilet, only to be greeted by my mother, who looked worried as hell. After I told her what happened through uncontrollable sobs, my dad was in the driveway already parking his car. My granny was left at the hospital for some treatment. He searched the house, but no one was found, so my mom told me it was just my imagination. But I know what I saw and heard. Fast forward 7 more years. I live in another house, and I randomly remembered about this incident and talked to my mom about it. She seemed quite hesitant about telling me this, but at the end I convinced her to tell me. What she said gave me chills. Apparently when I was 4, I started to stare at one particular corner in the kitchen and laugh like crazy. My mom asked me what was so funny, and every time I'd point to the same corner but never told her what was funny. After a few months, the random giggles I let out when staring at the corner didn't stop. What made my mom lose it was the fact that I started speaking random German words that I'd never heard before. We have no relatives that are German or can speak German, and I wasn't introduced to technology at that age. My mother knew it was German because she actually can speak a little bit but never spoke it. She bribed me with candy to tell her how I learned to say the following words in German: it, help, chocolate, shower, and war. My response completely shocked her. I pointed to the same corner again and said, "He taught me how." My mom kept her cool though. She asked me who I was talking about, and I said, "The man who makes me laugh." My mom asked me what he looked like, but I only said he looks like a shadow and that he's from Germany. When she asked where the man lived, I pointed to the second floor. This all made sense because I always hated the second floor and never went up there because I felt like I was being watched. My parents took it upon themselves to Google the history of the house, and sure enough, it was built by Germans. I don't remember any of this, but my mom kept on reassuring me it happened. My father said he remembers it too, but decided not to tell me until now. I talked to the German man in the corner up until 5 years of age. I'm pretty sure you can put 2 and 2 together, but if not, the man I saw when I was 7 was the same man I talked to when I was 4. Every time I go back to visit my grandma, I always feel uneasy. I was invited by my friend to go to his grandma's house about 50 miles from where I lived. I had never been there before, and we would be staying for a few days. When we arrived and pulled into the driveway, we were welcomed with snacks and some drinks. I immediately sensed something in the air of Paula, his grandmother's home, as we walked in, a strong vibe of not being alone and watched. It was very strong, and when Paula showed me my room where I would be sleeping, I put my bag down and went into the living room. There I saw what looked like a constant flash of light or a blanket passing by me at eye level. Let me describe the experience better. I was standing in the middle of the living room, and then a white color swept in front of my eyes. It looked like a piece of clothing being shown, and then it disappeared. It appeared and lasted for about a minute, and then it was gone. I went over to my friend and told him what happened, and he told me, "You should tell Paula what you just saw." I replied, I don't want to freak her out. My friend said, "Trust me. Paula doesn't scare easily, and she's open to hearing about weird things like what you just saw." So I walked over to the kitchen, and she had this warm smile and asked me to sit down and tell her what I just experienced. After I told her, she had this shocked look on her face, and she told me, "Joski, no one has ever experienced what you have in my home except you and myself, and that light you saw and the way it moved in front of you, I have lived in this home a long time, and these strange occurrences happen weekly." I have always been quite adventurous, so it stands to reason that when I had spare time alone, I would hop in my car and go exploring. I especially liked finding old abandoned homes, and there are a lot of them in Colorado. My husband hated the fact that I would do this completely alone, and he was always afraid that I would get into trouble. When I saw a no trespassing sign, it was an invitation, so it's no surprise that I would often be where I wasn't supposed to be. One day, while driving down old country roads, I happened upon an old abandoned farmhouse, so I pulled into the driveway. There was no garage or carport, so my car was right in plain sight. This old red brick house was all boarded up, but around the side of the house, there was an opening where one of the boards had fallen off, so I scrambled on up and crawled through. I found myself in front of a bedroom. Of course, it was rather dark, but there were cracks in the boards that let in just enough light that you could easily maneuver throughout the house without too much difficulty. Imagine my surprise to find everything still in the house, untouched. Near as I could tell, it had been empty since sometime in the 60s, so it had been sitting in this condition for at least 20 years. I found this very strange that no kids had gotten inside to party nor any evidence of a homeless person, especially since this house could be easily seen from I-25, a major highway that goes through the heart of Denver, and there was an exit within walking distance to this house. The living room had all the furniture, lamps, tables, and the bedrooms all had armoires and iron beds. Everything was left in the kitchen, along with home canned goods, spices, dishes. Everything was still there. In the bedroom where I entered, there was a portable toilet, and I wondered if someone had been sick. I got the feeling that that was the case. I spent hours in there just looking through pictures and postcards of the family that had lived there. There was a ton of Catholic paraphernalia too, crucifixes on the walls, rosary beads, and the like. It was fascinating to me, and I was trying to figure out why this family had left the house this way. I was so surprised when I came out how many hours had passed, but I chalked it up to being too involved and losing track of time. I have never worn a watch, so it wasn't hard to believe that this could happen. This place also wasn't too far from my house, so I would go there as often as I could. I would wander the grounds, investigating the sheds and the outside. The root cellar under the house was loaded with old canned goods and rotted root vegetables. The smell, of course, after all this time was non-existent, so it really wasn't unpleasant. I kept wondering what had happened there. I didn't know that the family that had owned this house lived just around the corner on the same street. How I found out was they caught me there and ran me off. I watched them as they left, and I saw where they went. Now, when I would go back, I'd look to see if they were home before I'd go in. So week after week, month after month, I would go back there. There was so much to explore. Time after time, they would catch me there again, and always run me off. I always wondered why they never called the police on me. I think they knew I was being haunted, although I was not aware at the time. Later on, after I had been exploring for a number of months, I began to find myself there with no recollection as to how or when I had gotten there. Every time I went in, hours and hours would go by, and every time I came out, I was always surprised at how much time had passed. I would think I was in there about 2 hours, but would find at least 6 hours had passed, and it was dusk. It would begin to get dark, and I would have to leave because, of course, there was no electricity. I was completely taken over, and got it into my mind that I wanted to buy this house. So I talked to my husband about it, never revealing to him that I had been going there. I kept it a secret from everyone, even my best friend. I did some research and tried to find out anything I could about it. I did find out it was built in 1910, but I could get no other information about it. I even tried to talk to the people that own the house, but they would never tell me anything and would just tell me to leave, again. I never damaged anything and left everything as it was. I never took anything from that house, until one day. I was drawn to an old green woven clothes hamper in very good condition, and since I needed one at home, I took it. No one would miss it, right? Now I had made a connection. Bad move. Soon after I took this hamper, I had a dream, or was it a dream? A figure in a dark hooded cloak approached me and said,
"Can I come into you and finish living out the rest of my life?"
I replied, "If I let you, then when can I live out the rest of my life?" And the figure disappeared and I woke up. Creepy, huh? I do believe that the hamper was the catalyst for this event. I should not have taken anything. Thou shalt not steal. There's always a reason for his commandments. The next time I went to the house, it had been completely demolished. The house and all the outbindings were gone. There was absolutely no trace that anything was ever there. Not a brick, not a board, not even the foundation. The root cellar had been filled in completely. I was devastated and wondered how and why they did this. The house was safe and could have been sold. I had been going there 2 and 3 times a week, so I don't know how this was accomplished so quickly. I wonder if the dream came after the destruction, but I had not known what they had done, and I guess the hamper made it possible for this spirit to come to me. I kept that hamper for a number of years and was always haunted by whatever had happened there. As long as I held on to it, I could not release myself from the spirit that inhabited that house, although I never had any more dreams. I finally did rid myself of it, though, because I knew as long as I hung on to it, I'd never be free. I don't remember how I disposed of it, but it wasn't until then that I was finally released, but this had gone on for years. I am very much more careful now when and where I go. I will stand outside and take the time to size up the spirit or spirits connected to these old places before entering. Please, if you are going out exploring and you find a place like this, do not take anything, as you don't know what you are bringing home. And if you have taken anything from a house like this, get rid of it, now. When I was 8 years old, my family moved into the house I grew up in. It wasn't an old house, and no one had died in it, and it didn't even feel creepy. It was just an average suburban house in your average southern suburbs. The way the house was set up, when you came in the front door, there was a hallway with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom to the right. The large living room was in front of you, with half a wall separating it from the dining room to the left, and the kitchen was on the other side of the dining room. Where the kitchen and living room met, there was another small hallway, the master bedroom, a bedroom that was used as an office, a bathroom, and then the breakfast nook leading to a laundry and utility area at the end of the kitchen. My room was to the right of the front door, and down the hallway past the bathroom, with the other bedroom on this hallway used for storage, mostly as I was my mother's only child, and my half-brother and sister didn't live with us and rarely came to visit. The first time anything really happened in the house, I was about 9, and I'd lost my last tooth. Still being a kid, of course, the tooth fairy was expected, so when I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a figure standing in the middle of my room, I assumed it was the tooth fairy. It was bald and only about 3 or 4 feet tall, about the size of an average child, standing completely still in the middle of my room. I remember my parents telling me that if I was awake, the tooth fairy wouldn't leave me any money, so I rolled over and went back to sleep. When I got up the next morning, I excitedly told my parents that I'd seen the tooth fairy the night before. I described what I'd seen, but they told me it was just a dream. For the next several years after that, I continued seeing and hearing minor things around the house. When I was home alone, cabinet doors would open and close. I'd hear dishes being moved around in the kitchen or catch movement out of the corner of my eye. The most common occurrence was often at night I'd wake up and see a young woman hovering over my bed. She was dressed like the Rosie the Riveter character from the old posters from the 1940s, with the red and white bandana around her hair and a denim shirt. When I would see her, she'd stare at me for a few minutes and then slowly float over my body and out through the wall behind me. I was never afraid of her, though. When I was about 12, my parents divorced, and it was just me and my mother living in the house. By the time I was in my late teens, my mother was rarely home, and my house became the hangout for me and my friends. Most nights, everyone gathering together to play Dungeons and Dragons or something similar after work. One night we were hanging out, but didn't want to play, so I pulled out a Ouija board I'd picked up at the local toy store a few weeks before, wanting to try it out. We sat in my room to play with the lights out and the door closed, and it went pretty normally, nothing crazy happening for the most part. The only strange thing that happened was at one point we asked something to show itself, and at that point we heard the front door open and close, and heavy footsteps come down the hall towards my room. The handle of my door started to turn, and one of the guys jumped up and locked the door before it could open. We didn't hear anything else, no footsteps moving away from the door or anything. And after a little while, we turned on the light and opened the door to see if my mother had come home unexpectedly. The house was empty, and the front door locked. We decided we'd had enough of that game at that point, and everyone went home. A few weeks later, we were hanging out at my house again, this time playing Dungeons and Dragons. Though one of the girls that usually came had to work late and had classes in the morning, so she said she wouldn't be coming. While we were sitting in the living room to play, at around 2 a.m, suddenly we heard footsteps run across my wooden front porch. It sounded like someone very short or a small child running quickly. Everyone in the room heard it, and we had a conversation as to if our friend had changed her mind and had just arrived, as she was very short, and it made more sense than a child running through the neighborhood at that time of night. When she never came into the house, we all got up to look, and there was no one outside, and her car wasn't in the yard. Her boyfriend, who was with us, gave her a call and verified that it wasn't her, and she'd just arrived home on the other side of town and was headed to bed. Around this time, the activity in the house picked up. I saw shadow figures with red eyes often in the living and dining room of the house, and heard footsteps and other noises at all hours of the day or night. I started waking up in my room to see hooded figures standing near my window and door. It was around this time my half-brother, who I was close to, passed away. It was sudden, and I hadn't seen him in years as he'd gotten into drugs, and my mother had decided to keep me away from him because she didn't want him to be a bad influence on me. After that, I'd wake up hearing his voice saying my name in the middle of the night often. On a whim one night, I sat down and typed out a letter to him on my computer that was in my bedroom since I was home alone that night and was bored. Now, this computer was hooked up to an old dot matrix printer, one of the really loud kinds that makes all kinds of racket when it's running. After I wrote the letter, I felt silly for it and deleted it without saving or printing it and shut down the computer before I went to bed. Around 3 a.m, I woke up and my bed was soaking wet. At first I thought my puppy had peed on the bed because he was too small to get down, even though he was housebroken and I'd taken him out just before bed. I got up to let him outside and change my bed sheets when I realized the wet was just water, and it was more than a tiny puppy could have made. On my way to take my blankets to the laundry room, I passed the bathroom in my hallway and noticed the light was on, even though I'd turned off all the lights before bed. There, sitting on the counter, was a pitcher from the kitchen with the inside still wet. When I was really young, my brother used to wake my sister and I up by throwing water on us because it made me laugh. When I got back into my room and started making my bed, I noticed a piece of paper laying on top of my printer. It was the letter that I'd written to him, never saved or printed. The computer was still shut down and the printer was off, but it had been printed out, torn off the printer, and laid on top as if someone had read it. Normal things like this continued for a few years when I lived there on and off, before things turned dark shortly before I moved out of the house for good. The hooded figures began to appear more often. I woke up one night with the feeling that I was being stared at, only to roll over and see what looked like a rotting corpse a few inches from my face. Another night I woke up to a hooded man standing at the foot of my bed, with my bedroom door open when it had been closed before. He held up his hand and a ball of blue light appeared in his palm, which he threw at my face. He and the ball disappeared just before it hit me, but the room was so cold that I could see my breath on a normally hot southern summer night. When I was in my early 20s, after I moved out for good, I had one last experience in the house. My mother hadn't been to the house in months and was preparing to sell it. I had told one of my cousins about the things that had happened there through the years. One night he decided that he was bored, and he and a friend of his would pick me up to go ghost hunting in the house while it was empty. Each of us had a camera and a voice recorder. We set a recorder in my old bedroom and spent an hour or two wandering around the house taking pictures. When we got done, we came back to my room and sat to listen to the recording and discuss all of the nothing that we had found. On the recording, we could hear our voices moving from room to room and talking about how my cousin's friend's camera had a sexy shutter sound and the fact that my camera stopped working almost as soon as we walked in the door. About 20 minutes into the recording, when we could hear all three of our voices echoing from the other side of the house, a deep voice that sounded like it was right up against the microphone said,
"Get the fuck out!"
We immediately obliged. I found out a few years later that my mom actually had several experiences in that house. She would wake up to find an older man in his 50s or 60s looking through her closet or seeing him just wandering around the house. When she'd say anything or get his attention, he'd turn around and look at her and then vanish. She always thought she was just dreaming or something, but with everything I saw over the years at that house, I can't help but to think it was something else.